Okay, as participants are still in the process of joining, I think we should get things started nevertheless to stay on time and on track. So I welcome everyone to Humanities on the Edge. My name is Marco Abel. I'm the Willa Cather Professor of English and Film Studies and Chair of the English Department at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln, Nebraska. Before we move to the main event, a lecture by MacArthur Fellow Professor Cristina Rivera Garza, I briefly would like to give you some context for this event. Humanities on the Edge is an annual speaker series that Roland Wegger, Associate Professor of English at UNL, and I co-founded. After our first year in 2010-2011, we started to collaborate with a set of colleagues. Our current team includes Jeanette Jones, Associate Professor of History and Ethnic Studies, who's been with us since our second year. Luis Othoniel Rosa, Assistant Professor of both Modern Languages and Literatures and Ethnic Studies, who is the lead organizer for this year and has been with us since our 10th anniversary year. And this year, we were also joined by Aaron Hanas, Curator of Academic Engagement at the Sheldon Museum of Art, which is where our events normally take place. This is the 11th year of our series, and Professor Rivera Garza is our 39th speaker. But she's the first to deliver her talk via Zoom. As much as we would have loved to host Professor Rivera Garza here in Lincoln, Nebraska, for we are generally quite a hospitable bunch and usually ensure that other members of our community, including students, get the chance to meet our guests. We turned necessity, as they say, into virtue, or perhaps better, we embraced these COVID-related circumstances as a unique possibility to reach an audience well beyond Lincoln by hosting this Zoom event. We're therefore truly thrilled to be joined by so many of you. I was told that some of you are in Mexico, others in Sweden, around the country in the United States, who are not here in Lincoln and its surroundings. If you like tonight's event and are curious about some of our previous or about future events, you might consider following our YouTube channel, where you can find recordings of many of our lectures. Just search for Humanities on the Edge in the YouTube search box. We founded Humanities on the Edge with the expressed purpose to promote humanities inquiry that approaches questions and problems facing us today from a rigorously theoretical perspective. To this end, each year we select a special topic that we ask our speakers to address. The topic of this year, as well as of our forthcoming 12th year, is a world of migrants, displacement, decoloniality, necro-capitalism. We decided to keep this year's topic also for next year because, with the exception of tonight's talk, we had to postpone all of our planned events due to COVID. We are excited for our lineup next year, however. In the fall, we host Sergio Delgado Moya of Emory University and Ramon Grosfoguel from Berkeley. And next spring, we'll host Thomas Nahl, University of Denver, and Anna Arabindan Kesson of Princeton University. If you want to stay informed about our events, please follow us on Facebook or via Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @UNLHOTE, that is @UNLHOTE. The desire to address the present through theoretically informed perspectives that was the founding impetus for Humanities on the Edge has by now also manifested itself in the book series Provocations, published by the University of Nebraska Press and co-edited by Roland and myself. Some of our Humanities on the Edge speakers have or are about to become Provocations authors, such as Greg Lambert, whose book The People Are Missing, Minor Literature Today, we published earlier this month. Or Tim Dean, whose co-authored book Hatred of Sex should come out late next year. In short, Humanities on the Edge started out from a desire to forge a local community of scholars interested in theory, but has since taken on a life of its own that we had not imagined at the time when we founded this series. For this, we are truly grateful and thank all of our previous speakers as well as collaborators, past and present. Speaking of being grateful, let me close by also saying thank you to our sponsors. Without the generous support of the University of Nebraska's Faculty Senate and Research Council, the Department of English, Modern Languages and Literatures, Communication Studies and Philosophy, as well as the Institute for Ethnic Studies and the Sheldon Museum of Art, we would not have been able to host tonight's speaker. Indeed, we would not have lasted so long without these longtime supporters. Last but not least, we also would like to thank Anthony Hawley, our longtime artist collaborator, for once again designing a terrific poster for us, which you might have seen on social media. Anthony has worked with us from day one. With this said, I will now pass the virtual microphone on to Luis Othoniel Rosa. Having earned his PhD from Princeton, he is the author of 2 novels published in Spanish, with the latest one recently published in English translation as Down with Gargamel. Luis is also the author of an academic study of Borges and is currently working on several new books, both academic and creative. As mentioned before, he is the lead organizer for this year, so all the credit must go to him for managing the feat of getting Professor Rivera Garza to agree to become our 39th Humanities on the Edge speaker. Luis, on to you.
Thanks everybody for coming. It is truly a great honor to be introducing Cristina Rivera Garza, a writer that I profoundly admire, and to have a conversation with all of you through the Q&A Zoom feature that you have there. And I start my introduction. In a 1944 little known essay titled Plagiarism and Infinite Literature, the Argentine writer Macedonio Fernandez says, "We ought to create an artistic revolution starting with literature and proclaim the free appropriation of the products of geniality to socialize intelligence, the same way that the modern economic schools are proclaiming the abolition of private property. A human body and a human mind are pieces of nature, and their products should belong to all in the name of justice." End of quote. I believe that Cristina Rivera Garza's writing laboratories today are the closest thing to that revolution that Macedonia wanted 80 years ago, especially in the ways that her theories are generating productive and reproductive networks and echoes. For example, her concepts of disappropriation and necro-writing are being used all around Latin America, in scholarly, creative, and activist circles, especially in Mexico and in the Hispanic literary community here in the US, but also in places like Puerto Rico, where we're also writing while mourning, counting and recounting our dead ones. The number 4,645 still makes us tremble. This means that Rivera Garza's own theories have been disappropriated and collectivized beyond her name. That means that her theories are working, right? We think that the same thing will happen in literary circles now in the US, in Anglo literary circles, now that her essays were translated to English just a few months ago, especially this book, The Restless Death, Necro-Writing and Disappropriation, which I profoundly recommend. Literature is appropriative. It turns community into intellectual property. Disappropriation is the call to action. Rivera Garza is the director and one of the founders of the first creative writing program in Spanish in the US at the PhD level, University of Houston. In a country where speaking Spanish makes you a target, in which Spanish is seen by many as the language of servitude, the creation of that program in itself is a form of activism. A teacher, a voracious reader, a literary theorist, a literary critic. She's also the author of many books of poetry, and she just won the very prestigious MacArthur grant just a few months ago, a grant that is given to geniuses in the US, the irony being that Rivera Garza writes against the very concept of geniality. But I think above all, Cristina Rivera Garza is a great novelist, one of the most studied and accomplished in Latin America today. Her novels always different, always experimenting, always upping the stakes of our craft, novels that take risks, painfully intelligent, and yet always exhibiting the warmth of those who write to generate something beyond the form of the book, novels that open up an archive so we can converse not just with the dead, but also to the yet to be born. I would like to highlight two of her novels. First, No One Will See Me Cry, Nadie Me Verá Llorar, her breakthrough novel that made her the winner of the Premio Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, which is one of the highest literary prizes in Latin America, and she won it twice, also for La Muerte Me Da. No One Will See Me Cry narrates the anguish of the modern artist when faced with the stories of the suffering told by those who are left behind in the name of progress and modernization. In many ways, it is a novel about the failure of modern art, and at the same time, a reproductive experiment in the art of storytelling. Her very last novel, published just a few months ago in Spanish, Autobiografía de El Algodón, Autobiography of Cotton, I believe is going to come out soon in English, which I'm in the middle of reading right now, is born out of a long research of the ancestry of the family of Rivera Garza in the northeast of Mexico, amidst workers of the cotton industry that go in strike, in the region of the valley, in the borderlands, a geographic space that at least since the Mexican-American War of the 1840s has been represented in main culture and in Anglo literature from Whitman to Cormac McCarthy as a place of violence and unruliness, an ugly space, the ugliest in our necro-capitalist world, and yet in Autobiografía del Algodón, this geography emerges in all of its beauty and filled with human possibilities. A quick spoiler, both José Revueltas and Gloria Anzaldúa, two of the most original Mexican thinkers of all time, appear in the novel, drinking from the communal well of these peoples. We think that Cristina is the perfect speaker to kick off our series of A World of Migrants, Displacement, Decoloniality, and Necrocapitalism that will continue next year as we are mourning the 500,000 that have died in this horrible pandemic in the US, while also denouncing the greed of pharmaceutical companies that in the name of intellectual property are leaving behind the poor countries of the world without vaccines. We cannot think of a better speaker to have among us than the Tamaulipeca Cristina Rivera Garza. Welcome, Cristina. We are so thankful that you accepted our invitation.
Luis, here I am. Luis, thank you so much for that introduction. I love Macedonio Fernandez's quote, and I think that's it's wonderful to start off this conversation just remembering such a wonderful and risk taker of an author from Latin America. Thank you so much for your warm welcoming, and I am really thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. We had a very interesting conversation this morning with some of your students at the University of Nebraska. And I'm just hoping to be able to continue with that conversation today. So I'm going to be talking, and what I want to share with you today is very much related to the book that Luis was mentioning a bit ago. It is in The Restless Dead. There's a chapter on, well, there are several chapters on disappropriation, but I would like to give you a summary, an introduction, if you will, to the concept and the ways in which I think I've been working with them in some of my contemporary work. In fact, the book that Luis also mentioned, Autobiografía del Algodón, Autobiography of Cotton, I think is very closely related to the series of ideas and intimations that I worked with in The Restless Dead. The Autobiografía del Algodón is mostly my reckoning, my retracing of the migrant experience of both paternal and maternal grandparents. In many ways, it fits so well with the topic of Humanities on the Edge theme for this year. in a world of migrants, in a world in which the richness of migration has turned into, or has become into one of the greatest tragedies of our time, I think is very important for those of us who write and who write books that we want to be closely connected to our context, to think about issues of authorship, about issues of collective work, collaborative work, about issues of voice and plurality, and more, of course. But this is, I guess, my way of contributing to a conversation that has been central both to my life as a dweller of the U.S.-Mexico border, and to my writing as of course an author who's been very much concerned with and willing to explore what it means to be on the edge, what it means to be on borders, geopolitical borders, on genre borders, on borders of aesthetic borders and intellectual borders as well. So thank you again. And I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. It's not the most technologically savvy one, but I think it helps me just to organize my thoughts as I share them with you. And but I'm really looking forward to the Q&A section of this event. I think that we do this. We appear in these little screens all together because we want to communicate, we want to engage in a conversation. So I'm really looking forward to that. Let me see, we did a tryout of this sharing. Disappropriation for All, in fact, is the title of one of the chapters of The Restless Death. Let me see how I'm going to be able to hear. I think in order for me to start this conversation, there are a couple of things that I believe I at times take for granted, but I think I have to put out there in the open. These are issues that are very central to a discussion that I've been developing, not on my own, obviously, a discussion that has been central to the workshops I've taught for a number of years, both in the MFA program in creative writing at the UC San Diego, at creative writing workshops I've been teaching all throughout Mexico, but specifically to the one I taught in Oaxaca a couple of years ago. And obviously my experience teaching and writing in Spanish at the newly created PhD program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston. And with this, what I want to emphasize is that this is not the kind of thinking or theoretical approach that is that is enclosed in an ivory tower. This is the kind of thinking that has helped me go through my own creative process and has allowed me to reimagine my own pedagogies as a professor. So it's very hands-on. I am a deep believer that the theory, that bringing theory into what we do is inescapable. I believe that transdisciplinary work, a work that is continuously interrogating the different fields in which we move might be incredibly rewarding, and to me is just a way in which I have taught myself how to think. So some of the issues that I at times take for granted, but that I have to speak very clearly about, is that nothing of what I'm going to be saying shortly will make sense if we don't first agree on the fact that writing is labor. The writing is way more than the result of various mysterious inspirations, that writing is not an isolated practice, and that writing involves concrete bodies, which are intense, volatile contact and relationship with other bodies in disputed material context. And perhaps this is very transparent for everybody, but let me just take a couple of minutes to just say that I believe writers work with language, and the language is a common good. That the language, let me see, I'm trying to, here, sorry. The language participates in the production and reproduction of social wealth. Earlier, before we started this conversation, we were talking about Bifo and some of his work, and he has this wonderful book where he links the specificity of language and how language and semiotic capitalism are inextricably linked. I think I'm echoing some of these ideas when I say that this force that I work with, this which I share with others, which is language. It's a component of the way in which we produce and reproduce a reality and social wealth, of course. I am thinking mostly of contemporary writing, but as the quote that Luis used to open up this event, I think we've been talking and thinking about disappropriation using a range of names and a range of concepts. But central to all of them is the idea that we do this together, that we're always in contact with others when we write, that this idea of the solitary writer close to the world is more the labor of ideology than a rendition of the practice of many contemporary writers. And I'm also thinking about a concept that I read in Josefina Ludmer's work of post-autonomous literatures, the kind of writing that is less concerned about its status as literary writing and more concerned about its capacity to produce present. So those are some of the issues that I at times take for granted that I wanted to share with you. And this is just a basic rendition of what I'm saying, you know, that image of the writer living on his own, because usually it was a he, with his own demons and creating the world anew, and in a contrasting image in which we use technology. It might be a pen as technology, it might be your laptop, but we are in connection always with others. And what it means to be in connection, it's always politically relevant, I believe. So yes, literature, in much of what I've been discussing, literature essentially, it's a process of appropriation. Historically, that's what it's been, a form of appropriation of what is not literature, a form of appropriation of experiences, of a range of experiences. Writers, and this again might be transparent to everyone here, but I like to remind ourselves that we always work with materials that are not our own, even if they are our most intimate memories, our most intimate secrets. We lived that experience and we were able to keep and recreate that memory because we are social beings and because we share a language with others. So even when I write, and just by virtue of putting words on my screen or on a paper, I'm participating of a practice that is enmeshed with a larger idea and experience of the world. So that's That's important to me. I'm taking some of these ideas from Jack Ranciere's Ice Pieces and the way in which he explores the making of this autonomous aesthetic regime, and the way in which he argues that we see these emerging in our world as the hierarchies between mechanical arts, the art crafts, and the fine arts start to falter. I think something of that sort might be taking place and has been taking place in the field of literature, when literature was treated as an autonomous field as such. I think once we start to think that as writers, that we always have to deal with, and in many cases obey or follow the lead of materials that are not around, I think the whole writing operation changes gears, and we have to start interrogating that experience from a radically different point of view. The language which we write belongs to many, and comes to us writers, or we come to it in a very dialectical relationship, full of experience, and as such, full of tension. So all the stories that we write, I think, are other people's stories. And the question, of course, is how do we go about bridging that gap? I'm using here some ideas, some of the ideas that you have found in Judith Butler's Giving an Account of Oneself, and specifically a very basic one that I found so generative. The fact that every single account of the I is too inevitably an account, Judith Butler would say, an account of the you. And I've taken the liberty of intervening the phrase, instead of the you, I think the we here is very pertinent. We are, when we overhear stories, when we try to recall what our grandparents have told us, when we read impacting stories in the newspapers and want to do something with that, when we visit archives and uncover documents that change completely the way in which we see our place in the world and our relationship to language, I think that we are participating in an account of the I, an account that is completely personal, that cannot be disassociated of a more interconnected account, which is the account of the we. I've been more recently working in a series of concepts related to geological writings, and I think they come almost naturally, so to speak, of the ideas of disappropriation. Essentially, what I believe I'm doing when I work as a disappropriative writer is that I explore and make visible, even tangible, in my texts, the textual layers of other people's writings, the actual material presence of other people's voices. And these could not be possible, would not have been possible if I didn't believe that those voices are there, they do exist. Writing is not giving voice to anyone. Writing is creating a space, a shared space, where we can listen to the voices that are already there, very much on their own. So one of the basic operations that I see disappropriation fulfilling here is just to bringing those voices, to bringing those texts, and to incorporate them in different layers, following different arrangements and aesthetic strategies. But making sure that a reader knows that there is a plurality at play here, that there is a collectivity here finding its way to you as a reader. So disappropriation unearths those layers of plurality that precede the individual production, that constitute the context of that production, the dialogue, so to speak, that we engage with as we write. Disappropriation exposes, therefore, that community work, that work in collaboration, that work, and this is a concept that I'm going to come back to, the work of central to communality. Disappropriation announces communal work rather than denouncing it, and here I'm participating of this play on words because sometimes, the policing that comes with showing these different voices, these different layers of text, at times calls for or poses the question, who is the owner? Who does this belong to? And then the denunciation comes as a result of that. I am more interested in the sharing, in the announcement. This is communal work. This is what you are getting into once you accept that contract with disappropriating writing. And of course, you, as many of you are students at universities, many of you are working in dissertations or papers. And I have learned, as you have, of course, that we always have to, as academic writers, we have to include quotes, and we have to acknowledge the participation of others through these apparatus in our own writing. The difference, though, with disappropriation in terms of creative writing is that whereas the academic finds the format already there and books, entire manuals that allow her to follow the rules, there are no specific rules in the creative world. But I think it's very important to look for ways, to forge ways in which this manifestation of community work is also enmeshed with aesthetically compelling strategies, that the taking of risks is both aesthetic and political. So in many ways, what I'm saying is that disappropriation at its core is a form of rewriting. There is no disappropriation without rewriting. So we are rewriting the works of others, we're rearranging them, we are recontextualizing them. And as Halal Tufik would say in his work about the surpassing disaster, perhaps with some luck and devotion, we are resuscitating that as well, and that is an important concept that I'll go back to. Something that is very important to me as I go through all these discussion on disappropriation is just so that all of us are aware that at least some of the issues that I take for granted as well is that debt is at the core of contemporary financial capitalism. And I think Fred Moten and Stephen Harney have argued brilliantly the relationship between debt and education. And I have tried to develop this linkage of debt and writing. I do believe, I agree with Moten and Harney, that we do not need credit and here credit, of course, has many meanings. But I do believe with them that what we have and what we shouldn't relinquish is a debt that will increase over time in such a way that it becomes unpayable. I think writing is that debt. We as writers, we owe. At times, there has been this discussion in literary history about the opposition between engaged art and art for its own sake. I am trying to move beyond that dichotomy. I think that if we use language that is being practiced, uttered, worked with by entire communities of practitioners and speakers, I think that makes me that puts me in a position of that. That makes a writer in that as I continue my own work. And that's what gives us weight. I think that gives the writing weight, I think, to fully assume, to fully embrace the fact that we are part of a larger community to begin with, obviously, but also that we are becoming indebted to that community as we continue with our own work. This is just the work that I've been referring to. I highly recommend it. I participated, I contributed to the translation of this work into Spanish. I think it should be read by all. That's the reason why I translate at times. So you can find that, I think, also online and for free. Obviously, the English version is right there for you, but I do believe that the Spanish version is also available online. We translated it as Los Abajo Comunes. And in doing that, I was trying to link the idea of the undercommon with the Mexican novel Los de Abajo, a novel of the Mexican Revolution. So I was trying to create that connection. So I told you that I was going to be talking a little bit about communality. To me, this is what made the whole transformation in the way I was thinking about collaboration and collectivities and pluralities. I was getting concerned about the way in which we use community at times in a very light manner, just to mean groups of peoples, and I know that there is a rather complex discussion behind this idea. But once I read the work by a Mije anthropologist, and there is an H missing there in anthropology, sorry about that, Floriberto Diaz, I knew that something clicked. Obviously Floriberto Diaz, who passed away a decade ago, I believe. Floriberto Diaz was not thinking about creating writing workshops and was not even thinking about creative writing as such in general. He was concerned about the survival of his own community in the highlands of Oaxaca. And he was bringing together issues that have become increasingly relevant for my own work. He was exploring community as a physical entity, as a territory, the physical and social space. He said, and this is a quote that I really think is very all-encompassing and beautiful at the same time, that this is where I stand up and where I sit down, el lugar donde me paro y me siento, in which people carry out productive and reproductive practices. So just placing that emphasis on territory and what it means as an idea and practice of sovereignty, and as the very materiality of that, I thought that just matched so well with what I was trying to think in terms of my own writing practice, but the writing that I saw many others or some others being engaged with. So community becomes communality when a relationship with the land is not based on property, but on mutual belonging. That is also central for Floriberto Diaz. And in this case, I tried to translate some of the major concepts that were dear and relevant for Floriberto Diaz in this idea of a book of communality, in a communalist book, so to speak, which embodies practices of production, reproduction, and appropriation and disappropriation as well. So the signature of the communalist book is an author in that. I do not believe in anonymity. I think it would be just better for all of us who participate, who contribute, who are members of a larger dialogue. I would like to see all of our names there. And I think it's also my responsibility as an author who's been working with these other people's materials to, as we say in Spanish, dar la cara por lo que acabo de hacer, right? Being responsible for the work that I've done in connection with texts, voices, and experiences of others. So that's the reason why I say that the book of Communality is not anonymous. This is the cover of Floriberto Diaz's book. I believe it's kind of hard to find the actual physical book, but I do believe it's available online. I highly, highly recommend it. Finally, I always take more time than I should, and I really want to talk with all of you. I think all of this is it's of tremendous relevance for me as an author, and I think for us as a community of readers, because what concerns us is because it affects us. Whatever is affecting us should be of concern to us. So I do believe with Raquel Gutierrez, another theorist that whose works have been an activist, in fact, whose works have been incredibly relevant in my way of approaching my trade. That disappropriative writers work, I think, on what Raquel Gutierrez called the internal horizons of society, in the most intimate contents of those in rebellion. I think those I agree with Raquel Gutierrez when she describes these internal horizons are unstable, conflictive, contradictory, and only partially known. And if you ask me, this is very close to a good definition of what writing gets at. The communalist book's destiny, I also believe, is the forum, is la asamblea, right? This is the cover of Raquel Gutierrez's book, a translation of the whole sentence that I read just a section of earlier. But that's even contradictory. They are only partially exhibited, or they can be found before in positive formulations, in the set of gaps and breaks between what is said and what is done, between what is not said and done, and the way how the desires and social capacities are expressed. Again, I don't think Raquel Gutierrez was thinking on creative writing, and much less on creative writing workshops, but I just think that if we accept that we are workers, that we work with this common good that is language, I think this makes so much sense. There is another word, and here sharing is not, I'm not misspelling sharing. I'm trying to emulate the concept of another Zapotec thinker, Jaime Luna. He's also worked very closely with the concept of communality, and he places a special emphasis on the issue of compartencia. And for those of you who speak Spanish, you know that the word is usually compartir is the verb. What gets shared is lo compartido, right? But compartencia is not. It's in a specific reformulation of the word, and that's reason. Just to, I was in my translation, I was trying to make to shape the word so as to reflect the transformation that Jaime Luna was creating here. So that's the reason why you see there sharing instead of sharing. But it is a concept that enables or that is central for Jaime Luna's understanding of the even distribution of knowledge among equals. Sharing takes place in the classroom, mostly in indigenous communities in Oaxaca through the fiesta, this ritual. And I do believe that writing could become also a side of sharing. When the book becomes a talk, just like the one that we are having today, when the book becomes a conversation, as the one that I hope to engage with each one of you later, soon, when the book is a matter that we discuss in a workshop, the book has escaped the page, has fly from the page or the screen, and it has become a component of the sharing that we are participating into right now. So this is the cover of Jaime Martinez Luna, El Camino Andado. Some of these books are hard to find, and for those of you who live and study in the United States, that's when interlibrary loan is just precious. So you'll be able to get them there. And for those of you who don't have interlibrary loan, I don't know what to recommend you, but just make friends with those who have interlibrary loan and try to share the goodies. A book is a sequence of spaces, claimed Ulises Carrion, an artist, a Mexican artist who lived a good portion of his life in Europe, in Denmark. He wrote what I believe is a very influential essay, one that, by the way, you can find translated into English, available in internet, online, The New Art of Making Books. So the book is a sequence of spaces. Each of these spaces is perceived at a different moment. A book is also a sequence of moments. A book is not a case of words, not a bag of words, not a bearer of words. Ulises Carrion famously argued that in the past, writers were responsible for the words, not for the books. Writers didn't write books, they wrote texts. And someone else, some manual laborers, were in charge of actually making the books. So for him, the new art of making the books tried to fuse both intellectual and manual laborers, and he very much called for artists, for writers to become book artists as well, to participate in the actual physical labor of making the book. And that's one of the reasons why, by the way, we at the University of Houston, in our PhD program in creative writing in Spanish, have acquired a risograph, which is some of you might be doing work with risographs, but it's for those of you who are not familiar with this, is a fancy copy machine that allows for a very inexpensive reproduction of books that could be wonderfully designed. So following on what I'm saying and on the steps of Ulises Carrion, we in our program are very much committed to not only writing text, but also making books. And so we all are learning, I'm learning how to work with these incredible machines. And that's the cover of the book that Luis showed earlier, and in which you can find many of these ideas in a larger argument. So far, I just wanted to bring this into our forum so that we can do what we came here to do, which is to talk to each other and to create dialogue. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Cristina. And I see that questions are beginning to appear. I'm going to ask you to please use the Q&A feature for the questions. And as you start typing up your questions, I have a first question for you, Cristina, that comes also from my graduate students that met with you earlier this morning. And they were asking about, we're all impressed and really interested in how you use literary theory or critical theory, really, right? For creative craft, right? We find that very refreshing. And I was thinking about two writers that we both love, Ricardo Piglia, who died recently. He always, and the question of reproduction. Ricardo Piglia always used to say that whoever invented the sonnet is better than Dante, because the generation of the poets are going to keep using the sonnet, whereas nobody's going to be able to write the comedy again. On the other hand, it's something that seems not connected. Silvia Federici, that we both were talking about her too, right? Her book has become so important for feminist movements all around the world, arguing too about how in modernity we have sexualized a form of labor, right? And we have productive labor, right, associated with men, and reproductive labor that is unpaid, right? connected to women. And that idea of reproductive work has become like super important for feminist groups all around the world. And here we have two ways of getting at this question of reproduction. So talk a little bit about that, because even in your talk today, the way that you were using theory seemed very reproducible, right? How do you see that dynamic of reproductive work and questions, and I'll be moderating the questions that keep appearing.
Yeah, sure. Wonderful. Yeah, we were talking earlier in a conversation with your students about some of the books that I've been using in my creative writing workshops and seminars. And as you can notice, and even in the brief notes that I shared with you, I'm not necessarily using literary theory. I used and I incorporate rather freely some of the concepts that I believe are incredibly important for a contemporary discussion about new materialisms, about the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, as you decide to approach this issue. And I do believe that as writers, we have a responsibility to move freely, to know, to be able to discuss these issues, and to use it as a igniting points. I never think about applying theory. I'm usually, as I tell my students, I read theory as I would read poetry, as a point of inspiration, as a way of connecting the dots according to strategies that are not necessarily, they don't come naturally to me, or they are not automatic to me. So I allow theory to subvert my way of thinking in such a way that my relationship to language gets transformed too. And with that kind of information, I'm able to work with the tools at hand, and in trying to always push for the limits. And this is not just a formal kind of exploration. And if it were only a formality of a matter of form, then I would be shorthanding myself, I think. I mean, the issue for me, it's always being very aware of what kind of materials I'm working with and try to honor them as closely and as deeply as I can. And I have found out that in doing something that is supposed to be very basic, very commonsensical even, I'm able to pose the aesthetic questions that eventually will take me to interrogate notions of genre and notions of whatever it's or has become hegemonic or canonical in the way of doing things. So one of the issues that I've been thinking through quite often in all these years is that if I'm willing to accept that I'm continuously writing with others, if I'm willing to embrace the fact that when I write, I am with others, then the matter of rewriting and in that way of reproducing is central to what I do. So how to choose, how to connect, how to look for materials, I think is way more central to this kind of writing operation rather than, the original idea or the thought that comes out of nowhere at times, by divine mediation, so to speak. I'm more interested in what we do as readers and as humble dwellers of our intellectual communities, the way in which we communicate, the way in which we connect things that perhaps were not intended to be connected in that way, but that our attention and our care bring together. And I think that's the case for, reading Floriberto Diaz, reading Jaime Luna, reading Raquel Gutierrez in the writing mode, in the creative writing mode. As I said, I'm sure they couldn't care less about that, but they cared about language, and they cared about social change, and they cared about our participation in constructing a different world. And I do believe that writing does that, or at least is a possibility, is a potency of writing that is so important for what I do. And I was also sharing with Luis in his classes this morning that this consideration about writing being labor is something that I take very seriously. I am, of course, not thinking of employment. I'm thinking about writing as the human activity that allows the production and reproduction of our context, right? And I was sharing with them the fact that I usually assign Alienated Labor, the essay by Karl Marx, in my intro classes to creative writing, so that we all agree, or at least we were touched by the idea that when we are with our thoughts thinking about the placement of that comma, in fact, we are working with others and we're participating in the reproduction of our conditions of production as well. So, to me, that's central in the embodiment of writing as a practice, as a social practice. Which connects us in economic, cultural, financial, even ways with others and with entire communities. The discussion, the very interesting discussion, to me, crucial discussion of Federici, in the way in which the sexual division of labor relegated women's participation in social reproduction to the domestic arena as an unpaid labor, I think it's incredibly relevant for the ways in which we at times tend to think about writing and art and not as labor, you know, and as an inspiration of sorts of that will take us away or separate from the communities and the societies that we are so intrinsic to. So. I know that the discussion is very complex. What is productive labor? What is a place of intensive labor? What is the idea of extensive forms of labor? And we could stay there forever. And it's a discussion that I loved very much. But the center of all these questions to me is the question that is central for Silvia Federici, which is the question of accumulation, how accumulation takes place, not once, as Marx believed, right, at the start of capitalism, but continuously, and how genderized bodies, feminized bodies, bodies that women's bodies have been used in ways that allows for forms of exploitation, specifically embodied in unpaid labor. I think we have a lot to think about in that sense, and in the way in which our labor as writers gets treated. Obviously, we are writing books, and books are commodities. We are participating in a multiplicity of exchanges in society. But I would also like to think of the forum of the Asamblea, and even of education, especially in public education, as a way of creating these alternative vias, alternative roads that might take a commodity that is circulating in commercial circuits, but at the same time is able to become central for conversations like the ones we're having today.
Now we have a lot of questions. Thank you. These are great questions. I'll try to do justice to all of them. We have a question from Jeff Lawrence, who is a professor of English in Rutgers. Thanks for joining us, Jeff. Hi, Cristina. I'm reading his question. Hi, Cristina. Los Muertos Indóciles was initially published in Mexico in 2013. Since then, the concept of appropriation has been a flashpoint in many cultural debates in the Americas, especially in the United States, right? I assume that he's thinking cultural appropriation too, right? Have you noticed a difference in the reception of the recent English language translation of your book, As the Restless Dead? has your thinking on disappropriation has changed over the past 8 years?
Wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking. I will take a couple of minutes just to remind all of you that this book was written initially as a series of weekly texts, and that were part of a column, a newspaper column that I maintained in Milenio, a national newspaper in Mexico. And this is a kind of writing that was very much very close to the reading I was doing back then, and very close to my teaching and my participation in those very debates that you mentioned in the United States. So back then I was teaching at UCSD, the MFA in creative writing, where people like Kathy Acker had studied, where people like David Antin had taught, where Jerry Rothenberg or later Ray Armentrout were professors as well. And my students were absolutely moved and were very willing to discuss issues of cultural appropriation, especially in that memorable debate with, what was the name of that collective, the Mongrel Collective? That call to arms, a series of very provocative ideas about the place of POC writers, about brown writers, minority writers, and the kinds of things that we were doing and willing to do in terms of the debate, a cultural debate, specifically in experimental communities. So that was central to what I was saying, to what I was thinking. It was not devoid of, it was not separated from that discussion at all. I guess the difference was that I was reading much of this debate in English, and I was writing most of my ideas in Spanish, and they were published in Spanish. But I was participating in the debate. The debate didn't know I was participating in it. That's the difference, right? And now it seems to me that some years later, I get to finally participate as I saw myself participating back then. I was very worried back then, as I remain now, that the issue of appropriation is being phrased at times in terms of giving permission to, in terms of a series of policing strategies that I am very cautious about. And that's the reason why I decided to work more closely. I invited my students to think more closely to go through appropriation as a problem that we face, but appropriation as a strategy that we find and we inherited from a range of practices. That's the reason why I was saying here, with the help of some of the language by Jack Rancière, that all art, and by all art I also mean all writing, is appropriation of what is not art, right? And it seemed to me that it was way more productive to talk about issues of uncovering this structural plurality, about bringing into the public arena of the book or the text that layering that is a time obscured by the very notion and practice of authorship as such, the very idea of genius. You are right, Luis. And so it seemed to me that yes, we have to think, and I do in my own practice think very closely about issues of race and about issues of class and gender. But at the same time, I think it's very important to me to keep the discussion in terms of that communality, that materiality and physicality that comes into play every time that we are writing with others. To me, that was more enriching, perhaps a way out, an alternative way of being very critical to issues of appropriation, but leaving the policing, the police work, just limiting that work and being able to incorporate that connection, the listening, the caring, the hospitality that the true text and true books are able to achieve. if lucky.
I think you already started answering this next question that I'm going to read by the Lincoln-based Colombian-American artist Nancy Friedman Sanchez. She asks, in the art world, it has been very common to appropriate work as a methodology to make artwork, right? In music, I think of sampling in terms of appropriation. Is what you are discussing as a disavowal of that form of creating?
Just the opposite. It seems to me that we all do that we do that in writing. That when we talk about the anxiety of influence, in fact, we're talking about all the many books, all the many ways of in which language work that are part of our own writing persona and our own writing practice. So it's not a way of saying that it doesn't exist. It's just the opposite, a way of saying we always do that. And it's been central to the creation of this autonomous field that we call art, or we call literature more specifically, and that contemporary forms of post-autonomous literatures are interrogating very clearly. So by acknowledging the fact that this is part of this is an important component of our tools, right? This is what we bring to the field. And by bringing it into the open, by acknowledging that participation, that connection, we are doing something rather subversive. And saying something that at the same time is very basic, that we don't do this work in isolation. We have never done this work in isolation. We've been acting as if this is something that benefits clearly the book industry. This is something that benefits clearly investors of all sorts. But this is something that I think we can interrogate also very clearly with our own practices and take to a different end. I'm not saying that we, as a writer, you shouldn't have an agent, and you shouldn't, look for a publishing house to circulate your works. I'm just saying that the field is multi-layered, and that a book that I published some of my books with Random House in the Spanish-speaking world, but at the same time, I am teaching classes, giving workshops, participating in specific movements, and I do believe that in those ways, I'm bringing the book back to the series of asambleas, to the series of mobilizations and acts of activism that nourished the book and the ideas in the first place. So just to make the answer rather short, is just the opposite. It's just recognizing that we've done it and looking for ways to continue doing it, because there is no escaping that. Continue doing it in a way that is aesthetically relevant, but it is also politically effective.
We have another question from one of our students in poetry, graduate students, Tara Ballard. And she asks, on page 77, she's quoting a specific page here in the novel.
That's wonderful.
Of the restless dead, you're right, and she quotes you. The vital wound which defines us as a species is solitude. The secret place, the refuge, a remnant of incommunicability, and therefore what opposes commercial exchange and the cheap transactions of utilitarianism. And now she asks you, could you please speak more to the relationship between this wound, solitude, right, and this writing in communality?
This is a wonderful question, and thank you for asking it. I believe I wrote that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tara. I wrote that in connection with Jean Genet's ideas about how the dead were the ultimate addressee of our work. And if that is the case, that's exactly where I place that phrase, and I'm going to act as though this is real because I don't have the book with me right now. But there is much talk about the solitude that we need as writers to be able to write, and the solitude that we suffer from as just contemporary dwellers of this world. I am, when I say that we write in community, that we write in communality, that we're never alone when we write, that there is no solitude in writing. What I'm referring to is the fact that we use language, that this force, this practice, this connection, this plasticity, this materiality in which we become social. So there is no way I can be by myself if I'm using these words to communicate with you. In the very uttering of them, there is our connection, and there are others participating in the way in which you and I are able to understand each other, which is very basic. Having said that, I also think that writing is a practice through which we can explore those have-said truths, those otherwise said elements. As Raquel Gutierrez said in that quote, this is where we go to when with the partially known truths, and we accept that this is as much as we're going to get, right? So there is that element, there is that possibility of connecting, but also the residue, the possibility of confirming a disconnection that in any case could be an element to think through and to recombine or reshape in order to be able to practice this kind of disappropriating writing. So I'm trying just to be clear about how literal I'm being with these concepts. So some students, when I start to talk about this disappropriating writing and there is no solitude in writing, they're like, oh, well, but I like to write in my studio, you know, without noises, and I'm fine with that. You don't have to be with that. And yes, indeed, we are lonely. And solitude is a wound, and through that wound we get to know a good part of what we are, capable or not, right? So I think sometimes I make my points, you know, in a very not literal way. It just there's an impact that I'm trying to achieve. But the complexity that comes with the whole experience, a multi-layered experience of trying to write with others, is something that remains open, and that remains, to use the sentence that you're quoting, that remains a wound, and that's what I see myself exploring in my books. In the autobiography of Cotton, I wrote extensively about the experience of my own family, my paternal grandparents and maternal grandparents, both migrants, although in different directions. My paternal grandparents walked all the way from central Mexico to the border, while my maternal grandparents were expelled from Texas in the 1930s. When President Hoover was issuing anti-immigrant legislation. So just to go back to the topic of this series, I was tracing that experience, and I wanted to use as much as I could their own voices, their own texts, and obviously it was difficult because they didn't know how to read and write. And so I had to go to archives, I had to resort to interviews, I had to, you know, take soil samples. I did whatever I could in order to be able to work as closely with my materials. And in doing so, and let me see, I'm gonna take a look at to that refuge, to that secret place. In doing so, I had to explore my connection to them in a rather intimate way too. So That's a wound I'm talking about. And that's what I think a disappropriating a work might be able to achieve. And that's a connectedness and the plurality that I'm trying to bring into play. At the end, though, I'm signing this work, and I am, as I said, I'm declaring myself responsible for whatever I chose and for whatever strategy I ended up using. Estoy dando la cara por lo que hago, right? And so that's where I'm not claiming that the wound is closed or healed. What I'm saying is that it's shared, and that in that sharing, there is a potentiality that I'm very much looking forward to. So in the best of cases, it's generative, and it will get other people to retrace their own migrating histories. And otherwise, it's still a book that you can really keep to yourself.
Wonderful. I have another question here that takes us in another interesting direction. Professor Ingrid Robin, professor here in Spanish and Ethnic Studies from Brazil. She's a translator too herself.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cristina, for a wonderful talk. As a translator, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, not only about the translation of your work to English. I was thinking about how long does it take, right? Those translations, right? But also translation more broadly as a means to establishing these conversations in the communality you refer to.
Thank you so much for that question too. I am deeply convinced that all act of writing is an act of translation. And as some translators would say, I believe that translation was first and then writing. So writing comes after translating, because we are translating an experience in many ways, you know, the experience of the body, a material experience, into the experience of the material body of language as such. So there is an act of translator that is intrinsic to the operation of writing. I have the utmost respect for translators, and I've been very lucky to work with a very young and very energetic and tremendously talented group of translators. And I usually approach translators as a way of rewriting, as collaborative work. I think, if nothing else, it is in translating that all these ideas about disappropriation come into being fully. What I'm discussing for writers, for creative writers in the book, I think those are issues that translators have gone through again and again and again, because they're always writing with others, right? Essentially, very openly. And they have to deal with how to move language from one mode to a different mode, right? How to honor that language, but at the same time, how to make it personal, how to adapt that magma, that energy into a different set of to a different mode, so to speak, right? So I believe that writing, that translation is a way of creating versions of a thing, of a text. So I'm less interested in being faithful, in being, and honoring and being faithful to me are two different things. One issue is to honor one text, and perhaps the best way of honoring certain materials is to be unfaithful to them, right? To betray them in certain ways that might bring what is of importance to us into a different code. And so that the honoring, the very important, which to me is way more relevant, is not necessarily linked to issues of faithfulness, right? So that relationship, which is active and is creative and is dynamic, has become over the years a central component of my creative process. In fact, I've been writing, as you know, in Spanish from within the United States, and that to me is an aesthetic and political position, of course. But at the same time, I live in this country, and I teach classes in English at times. I am a functional element of the society, and as many of you who are bilingual or trilingual or multilingual, a very important part of my social life develops in English, and also an important part of my writing life. So as of late, after I've been working with Sarah Booker, with Robin Myers, with Laura Canost, in the most recent translations, I've gotten used to do a zigzag in between the English and Spanish. So I write in Spanish, in the original Spanish, but then I revised in English, and so I rewrite in English, and then I come back and rewrite in Spanish. So that's the reason I'm saying that it's this zigzag, which is tremendously slow, but very enriching in the whole practice, and that helps me to detect, automatic responses. There are things that I do in either language that I just go to when I'm lazy, right? When I'm not writing, and just keeping both languages in check, and working very closely with them originally in both of them has become a methodology. So translation is not something that happens afterwards. Translation is now at the very heart of what I do, and I do believe that that has enhanced, that has reshaped my relationship with language. I do also believe that this is, the social repercussions of this, the political repercussions of this are not minor. Just moving freely, taking from one to the other, using this specular movement to provide analysis and critical explorations. I think that's something that translations allows us to do, and in that way, translation is hospitality embodied, and language and writing to me are very much so, or have the potentiality of doing so.
It is in the praxis of translation collaboratively, in the messiness, it really changes our relationship with language, right? Like I think that everyone should translate, right?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
I want a world in which every human is a translator, right? We have more questions. We have a question here by a young poet here in Nebraska, Caleb Peterson. He's interested in your idea of writing with textual layers.
Yeah.
What does it look like for a white person like myself to write in a way that shares the language as a common good, sharing the words that others have used before me without becoming exploitative? It's a good question.
Yeah. The last part of your question is a really important one, right? Because we always, as I said, if we analyze and read closely, we will always find traces of someone else's presence right there. And how do we do it? That's a question of to me, the most important question of all these discussions about appropriation. Because if we are doing it, if it comes with the territory, so to speak, if this is what we do as writers, in what way could we do it to avoid exploitation? That's the reason why I had to think about disappropriation. To me, just bringing this in the open, working as closely and as honorably as we can with those materials is of the utmost relevance. Earlier on, when I started to talk about Autobiography of Cotton, what I wanted to say is that even though it seemed that it was natural for me to tackle that issue, to write about my family, because what else is closer to you than your own family? I had to face the challenging reality that I didn't know my family. that as much as, and perhaps this is something that you might relate to, that as much as we claim to know, and once you get to actually do the work of research, the deep listening, you'll find out that there is a gap, a massive one, very often between family members. And the question in that case remains, what right do I have, right? And how do I use the memories of my own family to write this book? And I would have to say that was extremely relevant for me. There is a whole little chapter in that book in which I try to answer that question, because that is the question of writing. This is not the question about, just certain writers. I think all of us who write, because all of us are working with other people's materials, we have to go through that question. And that's a question, answering that question, going through that question is what makes us writers. Otherwise, we're just telling stories, which is fine. But being a writer involves, to me, the capacity to critically tackle that specific question. So in my case, for example, you might say, well, I was writing about what I knew the most. False. I didn't know. I mean, in fact, I was writing about it because I didn't know enough, because I had heard rumors, because I had heard half-truths, because I was intrigued enough by what I didn't know, and I was willing to put in the work, the research, the many hours of care that to me were very much involved in the way in which I was, finding the documents, thanks to the help of many, in doing so, from the archivist to the friend who helped me locate documents, to the questions I asked my members of my family about how to interpret specific words or ideas or scenes. So all that research work, I think, is the caring work that creates a relationship that to me is the only way of evading that exploitative capacity of writing, the damaging to capacity that writing has. So when we remain in the realm of stereotypes, when we don't question our conditions of production, when we are talking about bodies, claim that we talk about bodies, what failed to convey, to touch, to come close the very conflictive history of these bodies, I think that's when we are not caring, and that's when our work becomes exploitative. So bringing that into the open, making that manifest, making that palpable through some aesthetically compelling strategies, to me, that's being a way through that inescapable question. So what I ended up doing with this book about my family, I talked to them. They had to read my drafts. People who were involved in the research and in the whole process ideally read the draft. Some of them gave me comments, revised some of the points, told me, no, you misheard me here. I didn't say that. I said this otherwise, etc. So I think that connection that is constituent to the book, and that at the same time that exceeds the book, is what saves the book from becoming an exploitative tool. And at least that's the bet I'm making with disappropriation, because that's what it is, right? So we have to investigate what has been done before, what has been said, by whom, in what conditions. We're trying to connect the dots. We are asking questions. We're going to the places. We're placing our body where our body should be, right? We are doing all this work, and what it means is that I'm caring, that we are caring, and I think that's incredibly important.
We start rounding up. We have a very interesting comment by Juan Carlos Rosso. He says that this makes me think of the writing process as an invocation, right? Which is the awareness and acknowledgement of all the other others, you know, like in Eastern or indigenous cultures do, and not the writing process as the individual achievement of hermeneutics, right?
I love that comment, and I will pitch in. I will elaborate on that by saying that, you know, when, and I think that happens to all of us who write books, creative, academic, you know, all of them are creative to me, but well. So what do you want your book to do for the world? How do you want the book to be, to find a place to dwell in this world that we share? I think that's an important question. And that goes well beyond what kind of publishing house I want this book to become a commodity, yeah, right? Because, well, that's what books do too, and that's what they are, right? But there is this phrase that I heard from Antoine Volodin, a French writer. He said that for him, the true accomplishment in writing books, a book of his was a success when he knew that the book had become, was part of the dreams of others. So it was not only the knowledge that our readers keep in their, you know, in their daily life, the kinds of things that you think about, but when a book comes to your dreams, and when either as a character or as a structure and piece of your dreams, I was so taken by that idea. And that, I think, has a lot to do with the invocation that Rosa was talking about. So we are, and that brings into play also this engagement with the death, right? So this is not a metaphor. This is not just some nice way of saying that we would like our books to live longer lives and to be shared widely. If we believe that human and non-human beings remain on Earth in different forms. I'm referring here to the concept of Christina Sharp in The Residence Time, you know, how the bodies of the slaves that were thrown into the Atlantic Ocean have remained as sodium, as potassium, as different components there, and remain there for a number of years. If we're willing to believe that that is true, and I am willing to believe and to give agency to this presence on Earth, then this connection with the death is not just a metaphor. It's a material connection. And when we are willing to think about a multiplicity of materialities in our world, you know, human and non-human, inert and not inert, then I think the talk about this dialogue with the death takes it into a whole different notion and a whole different practice. So if invoking, I think, is a rather important spiritual practice, and to me it is important to talk about writing, yes, as a practice, yes, as a trade, yes, as a labor that we bring into the world, and at the same time, and because of that, as this possibility, at least, to invoke others who are with us in this world, and for whom we have to develop, to imagine different strategies to be able to bring this language, to translate this language of sodium, right, of the rock, of the water, of the plant, of the animal. What are we doing with our language to translate that experience and to work with them in this multi-layered, this vertical, this disappropriative way? So that, to me, is the challenge in a nutshell. Yeah.
We have some more questions, but I believe we're running out of time. So I'm going to be very egotistical and ask you a question for myself to start ending up. I mean, it's a two-part question about what you're writing right now. When I read you, when I talk to you, I see this attraction for the language of science. I was seeing it right now when you were speaking, right? You've worked with with technology, with the history of vanilla, with the history of cotton, with the earth, with geology. You mentioned that earlier on. So my question is, what are you working with right now? And is it connected in a way with this, with science, with what we can call in very general terms, science fiction, that is making that is proliferating all around the world right now, especially in Latin America?
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for asking that question again. You know, a couple of years ago, when I started to talk about geological writing, I once said, "Man, I wish I could have written a novel about a mine." And then a reader forced me to remember that I had done so in Nadie me verá llorar. That there is a whole aspect of mining life and mining history in San Luis Potosí, and I was kind of incredulous. And I went back to the book and I said, "Oh my gosh, I did it! Yes!" So I was so glad to find that there. And now that you mentioned the vanilla in that book, I'm equally, giddy about that. That, oh my gosh, I've been thinking about, writing with plants for a number of years now, 20 or so, and I'm glad to be reminded of that in these conversations. Yes, I have become increasingly interested in translating the world of plants, the plants' languages, more than animals. I haven't gotten to animals yet, but in plants specifically, some crops have been central to the development of my own family. So I've been trying to tackle that translation. How, like, for example, in the Autobiography of Cotton, I wanted to trace the ways in which we've been able to talk with cotton, through the language of agriculture, through the language of chemistry, fertilizers, through the language of banking, and the ways in which this whole production was measured, through the ways of union organizing. I think there are different dialects, so to speak, different languages in which we have been able to at least glimpse at the ways in which these members of the vegetable world speak. And Autobiography of Cotton was I visualized that as the first in a saga of 3 books. So this one belonged to the border, to the making of the border, and the activities of my grandparents. And the one that I have to start working on these days, the one that I'm doing the research, and I'm reading the documents, and I'm going through, all the preparation for the actual sitting in front of my computer. It relates to the very unglamorous potato. So I am trying to see why potatoes thrive. It was an incredible, successful crop on the slopes of the Nevado de Toluca, a dead volcano in central Mexico. Why this cultivar, this crop, was so successful, and why in 2010 it ceased existing right there. What kind of terroricide, what kind of ecological disaster, what form of solastalgia is taking place in that specific side of the world, which is already a very powerful geography in the indigenous history of Mexico, in the spiritual history of Mexico as well. And in a place in which we as a family developed and the tragedy of losing my sister took place. So I'm working more or less along the same lines that is structured Autobiography of Cotton, but I'm bringing that to a different set of languages surrounding potatoes and potato production, a different time in Mexican history, a different time in ecological history, a different time in our approach to the Anthropocene, and the many tragedies that have taken so many women away from us in so violent ways in Mexico at this point in time. So that's a project. And as you can see, I am once again working with some of the principles that I've been talking about today, but the cast is different. And I bet the writing will be different if I'm able to honor my materials as closely as I claim I do.
That's very exciting. We look forward to reading it. I'm afraid we have to start to end this webinar. Thank you so much, Cristina. We thoroughly enjoyed you. Sorry for the people in the audience that were not able to share your questions, but thank you so much for coming. It was a wonderful conversation, and we should stop here. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. And thank you for the invitation. And see you tomorrow, early tomorrow, Luis. Thank you, Marco. Yes. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Roland and Erin. And it's been quite a pleasure, sincerely. Okay.
All right. Good.